A lot of those non-competes would read, you can't work anywhere in the world or anywhere in the country for 5, 10 years doing this kind of work. The law is pretty clear that you have to have reasonable durational and geographic limitations. And so it was pretty easy to either try to negotiate something down from that because they were so unreasonable. I did have a crossover case where I was representing an individual who was from a socioeconomic class different than her three colleagues who were doing the exact same kind of programming. And she was, say, a socially disadvantaged county in Kansas, and the other three, who were of a different race, were in a socially advantaged county. She had a very defensible case. So I was helping her defendant. She was also a single mother raising four boys. I decided, in the context of that litigation against her, that I would file an EEOC claim against them for national origin discrimination because I believe they selected her based on her national origin being different than the other three. Her gender was different than the other three men.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun at all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi, I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to the Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today's episode is brought to you by Exec HQ, a C-suite fractional firm providing elite executives for your business. Today, Jeff is interviewing Andrew Marquardt. Andrew has been an attorney for over 30 years. His experience includes litigating employment lawsuits representing both plaintiffs and defendants. These cases included non-compete litigation, tort and contract claims, and discrimination suits. Andrew is the co-founder, CEO, and general counsel of Advantage Tech, an IT and professional services firm founded in 1997. Advantage Tech places on average 400 contract and full-time employees each year. You can learn more about Andrew at advantagetech.net. Let's listen as Jeff talks to Andrew.
Andrew, welcome this morning to the Corporate Couch.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be here.
Yeah, very excited to talk to you. A longtime IT firm in Kansas City. I think it's almost 28 years. So that's a great run. And you're also a JD, a lawyer. So that's always good to talk to lawyers. I will warn you, you are not getting paid by the hour for this episode. So, conciseness will be good.
You should have told me that up front.
I used to joke with our chief legal counsel at Eritana Therapeutics about his emails. I said, John, you're not a law firm anymore. Shorten the emails. You're not getting paid by the hour.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. We were introduced by Howie Fleischer, a Kansas City and insurance industry legend. So Howie knows a lot of people, and I'm grateful that he introduced us. But let's start with a fun question. I believe you grew up in the Topeka, Kansas area. Is that correct?
That's right. 1970, we had moved from St. Joe, my three brothers and I and my parents, and my dad took a job with the United Way running the local office. And my mother at the time was a stay-at-home mother. I was 5 years old. For all practical purposes, all through high school, I spent my time in Topeka before going to KU and then coming back to Topeka for law school sometime later.
Nice. What was fun for you growing up in Topeka? What did you love doing?
Well, much different than what our kids have experienced today is we were allowed just to sort of run wild, my brothers and I, and, go chase snakes, frogs, play in a lake. And no one was really overly concerned as to where you were. And you always kind of looked out for each other. You could play pickup sandlot games and, riding bikes to school from a great distance and playing sports at a young age. And it was just sort of a golden time, prior to getting into high school when a lot of the traditional issues sort of start popping up for kids that age.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, there's a certain age demographic which I belong to, as well as you. That yeah, it's very interesting. People will talk about that time, and yeah, it was different.
Another story that reminded me of that era is my little brother found cassette tapes that we had recorded back in the mid to late 70s. And then when you got one of those tape recorders with a microphone for Christmas, it was a big, big deal. And so he and I were playing DJ on the radio back and forth. And it was funny to listen to the words. We must have said the word groovy about 20 times, and we were probably 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. So I still laugh when I think back to those days, and anything before social media, cell phones, you just interacted with the people that were around you.
That's so funny you mentioned cassettes because I 100% agree. I remember I got mine with the microphone, and I used to interview my kids around the block. And I remember recording, like I didn't even know FM radio existed, and I would record like just the top 40. And it would have commercials sometimes because you don't stop the thing, and that's how I would listen to music.
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Any aspirations as a child? Some people say, hey, when I'm an adult, I want to be this. Did you have any of that?
There is a moment that's quite clear to me, and it was when we were in our station wagon and we were, I think, in the St. Louis area driving through. And I remember talking to my mom, and of course, my three brothers are in the car too, back before you had seatbelts, so you could go anywhere you wanted to in that station wagon. But I remember saying, I just am very ambitious and really want to do the best I can. And when I was younger, I thought I was going to be a minister. And then with some of the behavioral changes that occur when you are a teenager, that particular goal did not create just skeletons in the closet. It, I think, created a graveyard in the closet for me. So I decided to change my gears and think, well, I can just work hard. I can work harder physically than anybody else. But yeah, I had ambition from a pretty young age. And I had realized that was it wasn't unusual, but it was definitely different than what I could pick up from my people around me, my friends. And I've always been sort of intense in that way.
Yeah, interesting. Would you want to share any of the behavioral changes you experienced in high school?
That's really funny. Well, yeah, you tend to start acting out if there are things going on in your life that sort of cause you to be displaced from your normal setting. And my parents divorced in 1979, and I was 14. And my oldest brother, Eric, was at K State and died of cancer. He was in the architecture program there in early 1981. So moving from a family of six under one roof to moving into an apartment with my dad and the loss of a brother, and then moving from school to school, you're really put in a situation where you got to figure out how to get along. You got to figure out how to make friends. You've got to put yourself out there or you're going to be a very lonely person. Call it ignorance. But at that age, I was like, I don't have any other choice but to try to move forward and create my own identity that is separate and different from the family identity that I had 18 months earlier. Not to be too specific, but a lot of the crowd I ran with in high school to this day, they are my very best friends in the world. And, they're just great people, former fireman, HVAC, business owner, entrepreneur, all still in Topeka, except maybe one person. So as awful as a lot of those experiences were, they certainly helped shape the direction in which I was going to have to go because there was no looking back.
Yeah, wow. That's I'm so sorry to hear about your brother. That's had to be such a traumatic experience. Oh my God. And layer that on with the divorce of your parents. So wow. I lost my mom right before my 5th birthday. So my dad had early onset Alzheimer's when I was about 10 years old. So I kind of, nobody could fit in anybody else's shoes, but I definitely can relate to the, traumatic events at an early age. So tell the audience kind of how you, I don't know, pivot is the right word, but kind of the changes in you and how it has even impacted, your whole career and even as you are today.
And I think for a lot of people which if you live long enough, everyone's experienced some level of loss. With me, there was kind of what I would call the pre-Eric life prior to age 15, and then sort of the post-Eric life until I got married, and then since then. And I can remember, back in the 70s, he had a GTO, and those kids in the 70s would drag Topeka Boulevard. That's what you did. It was like American Graffiti days, and he was required to babysit my little brother and I. So when my parents were gone, he would shove us in the back seat of his GTO, and we'd be dragging around, and I could hear him going by a car and some girls like saying hi to him. And my little brother and I, and our heads popping up from the back seat, and him swinging, telling us to get down so it doesn't look like he's babysitting us. And it was just fun. And the reason I mention that is because we just adored the guy. I mean, in a way, almost idolized him. He was the oldest in the family. He was just a great guy, and you wanted to be around him. And then the pivot happened because everyone that I grew up with, that knew my family of six, that I went to church with and a private school with, all that changed from the divorce to the death. And then I was in a new era where I'm like, well, no one really knew me from that family of six. No one knew him. There's no one else to idolize. And so my pivot really became trying to figure out how to, like I mentioned earlier, how to get along without that type of a support mechanism. I didn't really see it that way at the time. I just saw it as shit happens, for lack of a better word, and you just need to figure it out. And it wasn't as if it wasn't fraught with a bunch of difficulty, and really was tough when I got to college and trying to say, okay, look, I've got to really figure this out if I'm going to get a college degree. Like a lot of people, I know they go into the first year or two. It's pretty common, I think, in college for a lot of people to say, man, I need to get it together, or I need to do something different. And that was especially true for me. But the other thing that happened at the end of my sophomore year, my dad had gotten remarried, and I had been living with my dad. And I just remember thinking, I am really on my own now and need to figure this out. There's no safety net anymore. And that, in retrospect, helped me tremendously. I was in a fraternity, a lot of great fraternity brothers. They were wonderful people, and I'm still friends with a lot of them to this day. But I could sense a clear difference between their lives and my life. And some of them are here in Kansas City and can say, yeah, you just turned a switch between your sophomore and junior year. You quit going out. You just studied all the time. You stayed engaged to a certain level, but you fully understood that in order to make it in life, you were going to have to change your habits a little bit.
So you went to KU, University of Kansas, in beautiful Lawrence. Was journalism your first major, or did you change majors from freshman to senior year?
Yeah, freshman year, I was in radio and television until Brent Musburger and Gary Bender came to KU to talk about they're the only two people in the world making $100,000 a year doing broadcasting. And I was like, well, my odds aren't very good here. I better pivot over to business. And I was in one of those huge classrooms at Wesco in an accounting class, which is kind of a weed out class. Back then it was called B241, I think, or B240. And oh man, I suffered enormously in that class, mainly because I wasn't chimed in. So I did so poorly. I think I got the big F in that class, and said, I need to figure out something I can do. And I was always a writer, so I always enjoyed writing. And that's when I moved over to the journalism school. So that was my third move. And by that time, I'd wasted a lot of time. My GPA was terrible. But finally, I found what I thought was a home that more closely aligned with what my personality was like, and at least could graduate. Wasn't even thinking about law school at that time. It was just like, get a degree and get out. And I always liked working as much as I could doing different things, because school was not anything I enjoyed at all. It was a means to an end, and you were told, get a degree and that'll improve your life.
Yeah, interesting. But it's funny you mentioned radio and broadcasting, because as we started our conversation, I'm like, Andrew has a great voice. My older brother told me I had a face for radio, so there you go.
Well, you have a voice for radio too. You both look and sound good.
Well, thank you. So you graduated with a journalism degree, and what was kind of the first job post college, and how did you get it?
My first job was at Sherwin-Williams in an assistant manager program at a store in Mission, Kansas, up here in Kansas City, making 17,000 a year. The only reason I was even able to get that job is because I started my own painting company in college, hiring my buddies after I went out and bid on jobs to help me, you know, try to get painting gigs in the summer. And I remember what we did. I used my drawing skills and created a poster. And I don't know if you remember this, at the bottom, you would write your phone number like 25 times and then put a scissors between the numbers. Then I put them up at grocery stores around town or pharmacies or whatever so people could tear off your number and call you. And my sales was, hey, we're college kids, we work hard, we're, going to be able to charge you less than some other person. So I ended up doing quite well and really enjoyed what I learned as a high school and college student, kind of running my own painting business. But it was the only job I could get. And it was terrible for me, at least. I think Sherwin Williams is great. I use their paint all the time and had a good relationship with them. But then I moved in after several months into advertising for a company out of Topeka that I had actually clerked for in my last summer at KU. And they were interesting because they had a little division that actually created children's promotional meal cartons for independent restaurateurs to compete with McDonald's Happy Meal, which was produced, it might have been Bernstein and Rain here in Kansas City. So I traveled to food shows in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, trying to peddle these boxes and just being on your feet all day. That was a great learning experience for
Yeah,
me.
that's phenomenal. Paint store, Sherwin Williams. That's a great first job, or at least first job story. Just one question about your college painting business. Did you have employee issues because they were your buddies? Did they show up when they were supposed to?
Yeah, they did. I had one in particular. He did not have a job, and he was one of my high school buddies. He used to defend me in fights all the time. He was a wrestler and just a great guy. But man, that guy could work hard. I thought I could work hard, physically hard, but he'd work 10, 12 hours on a house. And most of the business we got required a lot of scraping, sanding, priming. A lot of the professional painters just did not want to deal with that, or they priced themselves out of the market. So that was kind of our niche. He never complained once. He was happy with what I was giving him and paying him because it was more than what he would have earned working at a gas station or something like
Yeah.
that. And then I had a couple other friends that had helped me out, that had helped me get business, and we would work out little deals here and there. I mean, it was such a small little operation, but yet at the end of the day, which I still follow this philosophy, friendship is paramount. Family relationships are paramount. And if anything related to business gets in the way of those relationships, it's time to examine a different route.
Yeah, no, I love that philosophy. So, what was it during graduating from KU and working these jobs at Sherwin Williams and the advertising agency that made you think, I think I'm going to go to law school?
My mother, towards the end of her life, she had become a Court of Appeals judge for the state of Kansas, appointed by Governor Graves, and had only become a lawyer in the 70s when she knew my parents were getting divorced, and was at the top of her class or very close to it, and was only one of, I think, 6 women out of 450 students at Washburn Law School. And she was the one, while I was living at home working at the ad agency for, again, 17,000, and it said, why don't you give law school a shot? I mean, you're probably going to come out of the gate with more skills and the ability to earn more money. I didn't think there was a chance in heck that I would be able to even get into law school, but I went ahead and studied vigorously when I was working at the ad agency to try to improve my study skills, and took a course up in Lawrence and took mock tests every weekend for 8 months to kind of get an idea. Ended up taking it, doing pretty well on it, thinking I would hate research and writing in law school, and absolutely fell in love with research and writing. I love law school. It was so unbelievably interesting to me. I was 24 when I went in. That was really a life-changing experience in education. So it was really my mom instilling confidence, right? Someone in your support group saying, I think you can do this. I don't, you may not think you can do it, but I think it's definitely within your reach, and why not give it a try?
I know you lived with your dad a lot during the divorce, but your mom was kind of a trailblazer to kind of pivot from kind of being the primary caretaker of your family and your siblings to, okay, I got to do something because I need to earn money. And she goes to law school, and you said she became a judge.
Yeah, she really has received a lot of recognition in the state of Kansas, probably primarily from the Bar Association, for what she was able to do. I know when they got to Topeka, I think she was going over to the education school at Washburn thinking she'd get a master's, and ended up walking over to the law school and decided to take the law school admittance test and was brilliant, and then spent a good part of her career representing women who were getting divorced from their husbands, which was an interesting, difficult, and complex issue back in the 70s. And she's a real trailblazer because she was the first woman president of the Kansas Bar Association. That did not come without some trials. The law firm that hired her out of law school, which was rare, she might have been one of the only practicing, if not the only practicing woman in law practice in Topeka at the time, they did not want her running for president of the Bar Association. This was in 1986. She just picked up roots, dropped her book of business, and then went across the street with a gentleman she knew, which was of the opposite political party. And he said, I support you 100%. And she ended up winning whatever the vote was and how that transpires. And had a great year in 86, being the first woman president of the Kansas Bar Association. She was one of the top 10 business women recognized about that same time with the American Business Women's Association. She was one of the longest standing delegates from the state of Kansas to the American Bar Association. She worked extensively with the Pentagon on sexual abuse issues towards the end of her career and investigations and providing reports with some other colleagues of her from across the country. So she accomplished a lot. And as I said, both in a speech after she had passed to junior achievement and then prior to her getting sworn in, she never in a million years thought a little girl peeling potatoes on a dirt racetrack in the middle of the country in Illinois would one ever get a college education, would one ever get a law degree, would ever practice law, would ever become a judge. Her example and just knowing that that was my mother provided tremendous foundation for me. And then she said, hey, I'm living on the shoulders of my father, she was saying, who was a German immigrant, came over here at age 17, didn't know any English, and worked in the steel mills of Chicago. She goes, I was very fortunate because someone took an interest in me when I was a young 18-year-old secretary at the steel mills in Chicago, and they got me a Pullman grant so I could go to college. But there were people willing to help that took an interest, just like she had in me. There is no way you get through this life and attribute any success that you might have to yourself. That's a fallacy. It's always standing on the shoulders of someone that came before you.
Yeah, yeah, it's so important. But what a gift! I mean, our ancestors, and especially with your mom, to give you and your siblings on that. It's phenomenal. So after law school, what was the kind of the plan? How did you get your first job out of law school? And were you thinking about specializing in a certain area, or did it just happen by luck?
I was probably going to be litigation. I was worried I'm not going to make more than 17,000 a year, working for some law firm anywhere in the middle of Kansas somewhere. Ironically, I did well enough in law school where I could get interviews with some bigger firms that base salary was, 50,000 at the time, let's say. And I interviewed with firms in Kansas City and Wichita, and Pulcinelli was a smaller firm at the time, but they had several people in leadership that had gone to Washburn Law School. So again, I was, I think, lucky enough to have a couple people there that were from Washburn and were able to interview with me and take a chance on me. And, I'm forever grateful that they did. I stayed there about 2 years, but I didn't know what was going to happen. But I learned so much about refining research and writing, um, how you handle motions and just kind of the gamut on litigation from start to finish, mainly defending companies. But it was an invaluable experience. And I sort of had a sense then that I had sort of breached another obstacle and was able to get through it and put myself on a level that might lead to better things down the road.
So, and it looked like during your law career, you got into kind of, I'll call HR law, job loss, workplace law. When did that occur? After Polsinelli?
I touched on it a little bit at Polsinelli. I think my DNA, for one thing, is really dialed into HR issues. My dad, he's retired now, still alive. He was a social worker. And so he was always working with people and trying to figure out the issues. Most of them obviously were personal, some were work related. But my mom had been an HR lawyer in addition to a domestic relations attorney. And if memory serves, back at a certain time, and I think it was in the 80s, the state of Kansas revised the discrimination statute to allow a discrimination claim to be tried to a jury. And I think she was the first attorney to try a discrimination case to a jury in Topeka once that remedy was made available. And so it's kind of a combination of variables. One, I was interested in the area. Two, I had tapped into it a little bit with Polsinelli. Three, it was something that my mom had done, and I had grown up watching her in that particular arena. Four, after I went out on my own, there were just a lot of cases out there that one could take and no one else wanted to take because they're rough. They're really rough cases. So I think that's what led me into the HR world, if you will.
Yeah, I saw a recent post of yours. I know things are changing with non-compete clauses in employment agreements, and I've always questioned it, having signed a lot, working for 12, 13 different companies, because I always thought, well, you have non-competes, but like if you have a reduction in force, you're not allowing me to partake in in gainful employment with somebody else. But any thoughts on that, what's happening in that non-compete area right now?
Yes, I wrote a fairly extensive article. It was published in the International In-House Counsel Journal in London about U.S. developments in non-compete law. After I wrote that, the FTC came out with its rule, which was largely based on President Biden issuing a mandate to them to come up with something that would take the bite out of non-competes. It's such an involved subject. It's not that complex, but what the courts have to do and what society has to do and what legislative bodies have to do is balance the interest between companies maintaining their ability based on information that they have about their process, their clients, their prospects, from being wiped out by an employee who, once that employee has access to that information, can just walk out the door and just pick up where they left off after they learned the information and learned a lot about how to work in that particular arena, which isn't always the case. And so these cases are sort of fact by fact decided. And I think back in the industrial age, prior to becoming largely a service-based economy, these things weren't that big of a deal. I mean, the cost to entry, if you wanted to go start a competing manufacturing plant, had to have been too much for 99% of the population. But there are so many service-based companies with such low barriers to entry that almost anybody, once they just pick up on small little nuances, can go out there and compete against you. And I think, as I wrote in my articles, there's been a lot that's changed. A federal judge down in Dallas, Texas, issued a permanent injunction. I think it was last week or the week before, after issuing a temporary injunction blocking the FTC's rule, which essentially eradicated non-competes, from going into effect. That rule was supposed to go into effect September 4th this year. And effectively, that judge's decision, put a stake in it for now, at least. And I just don't see how that type of rule that the FTC put out there, in conjunction with, I think, a lot of collaboration with the National Labor Relations Board, is ever going to stick. You have like 40 million people subject to non-competes out there in the United States. And what was interesting about what the federal court permanent injunction said was, down in Texas, was Hey, the preliminary injunction is basically FTC. We don't think you have the authority to even issue such a ruling. That's just beyond the scope of what you're allowed to do. But in the permanent injunction, they said, well, not only that, but if you get to the substance of what you're trying to do, we think it's so far overreaching and ill defined and broad that we would strike it down on that basis as well. So it's kind of a double whammy against the FTC rule, and something's going to have to happen. But as I see it right now, it still remains in the hands of the states. And there are a lot of states, as I put in one of my articles, that have lessened the effect and the enforceability of non-competes relative to certain types of employees, certain pay grades, all in an effort to really take the people that really don't need non-competes against them out of the equation. It's one thing to have someone who's going to wipe out half your sales and take all the clients and hurt you with it. It's another thing to have, as a matter of course, everyone that might be working on an assembly line, or making less than 15 bucks an hour to sign one. That sort of creates an effect that no one really wants to see happen. And the irony is, I'm a lawyer, and lawyers no non-compete. You can pick up and take your book of business with you wherever you go. So that's another little wrinkle I think is unusual for the law profession.
Interesting. What you mentioned, your article was published in a London publication, I believe. What is kind of the big difference between kind of U.S. non-compete legislation and laws versus Europe or outside the U.S.?
Well, I'm not as familiar with it. I know if you're talking about, let's say, London-based financial companies, a lot of them are going to have presences in Europe and throughout the United States. They would implore the most protective agreements that they could by law. And like I said, I'm not entirely familiar with the UK, but one thing I'm sure of is that they definitely are going to be in a position where they can protect trade secrets and clients and people from just taking off with that information.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about kind of how you co-founded Advantage Tech, a professional staffing and IT recruiting firm. It's been around for about 28 years, but it looked like you kind of were dabbling in both still working for the law firm while you founded the company. Maybe explain that whole process and where you were at the time in your career when you did it.
Sure. I was practicing on my own by that time and doing almost exclusively all employee plaintiffs work. One subset of that was I was also handling former employees who had been sued on their non compete agreements they had with their former employer. And at that time, the majority of them were computer programmers. In that period of time, a lot of those non competes would read, you can't work anywhere in the world or anywhere in the country for 5, 10 years doing this kind of work. The law is pretty clear that you have to have reasonable durational and geographic limitations. And so it was pretty easy to either try to negotiate something down from that because they were so unreasonable. And at the same time, I did have a crossover case where I was representing an individual who was from a socioeconomic class different than her three colleagues who were doing the exact same kind of programming. And she was from, I would say, a socially disadvantaged county in Kansas, and the other three who were of a different race were in a socially advantaged county. So they only went after her, and she had a very defensible case. And so I was helping her defend it. She was also a single mother raising four boys, which a little irony there. I decided in the context of that litigation against her that I would file an EEOC claim against them for national origin discrimination because I believe they selected her based on her national origin being different than the other three. Her gender was different than the other three men. It was a piece of leverage that was usable to get them off her back and also try to educate the company. Think twice before you jump in and go after someone you think that can't defend themselves because you want to make an example out of them. I think the landscape has changed tremendously, but that's sort of what bridged me into doing Advantage Tech, temporary staffing, started in telecom with Sprint, ended up around 1999, 2000, 2001, segueing into primarily IT. And then during COVID, we added another division, which is all other professional services, mainly office type people, could be accountants, engineers, receptionists, whatever, that are not necessarily IT related jobs.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Exec HQ, a C-suite fractional firm providing elite executives for your business. If you're having challenges taking your business to the next level, if you want to augment your leadership team, or prepare your company for increased growth, profitability, and an eventual successful exit, we have seasoned executives from every C-suite position ensuring a perfect fit for your needs and the dynamics of your industry. You will work with senior leaders who like to roll up their sleeves while checking their egos at the door. They can help your business in specific services such as strategic planning, executive leadership coaching, financial management, corporate governance, marketing, sales management, and many other advisory solutions vital to your business success. That's exechq.com. To learn more, go to exechq.com or email Jeff Palacio at jeff.palacio@exechq.com.
You were representing a lot of IT people in this, but I mean, it's another thing to start a whole company about, with your knowledge. I mean, what was the impetus behind that?
That's a good question because I don't think a lot of people, some people may know this, but this was a huge issue in my decision. Let me start first by saying my brother-in-law was working in sales for, everyone pretty much knows them as Tech Systems. It's a privately owned staffing company. I think it does about 5 billion in revenue now across the world. And it was founded by Steve Bisciotti, who owns the Baltimore Ravens. Didn't know him at the time. No one knew who the guy was. And so he was ready and available to take over sales responsibilities if we were to start a company. And we were at the American Royal in 1997. And he's like, Andrew, you got the legal background. I got the sales background. Why don't we put our heads together and just start something? And by that time, I had already incorporated something. But the genesis behind doing it was when I was doing those non-compete defenses, I realized a lot of them were against subcontracting LLCs that these developers worked for when they went to work for the primary client. And I was like, oh, there's a spread going on there between what the small LLC subcontracting company is paying the programmer and then what they're billing the end client. It wasn't hard to discover that there was sort of this undercurrent of companies that were doing this sort of work, basically creating a bit of margin, no different than in a law firm, right? Paying an associate something and then billing their hourly rate at something else. What had happened in the early 90s is Microsoft got sued by the Department of Labor. And for example, they had 1,000 employees that were W-2s, all programmers. They had 1,000 1099 programmers, all 2,000 doing exactly the same thing. The 1,000 that were 1099 complained, and it led to an action by the Department of Labor saying, hey, wait a minute, we're not getting the same benefits that these 1,000 W-2s are, and we're certainly not enjoying the price appreciation on Microsoft stock. So it led to this case and this litigation, and finally to a conclusion, and they were recognized as W-2s. What happened was Microsoft then went out and said, we need to have these companies created out there that will hire these programmers as their W-2, and we can accomplish the same thing we were doing when they were 1099s is you're the employer, Andrew, you hire them onto your payroll, you make them your W-2s, offer them some health insurance, and then you farm them out back to us. And that way we know we're covered. Now, that's an oversimplification of the issue, since I've also written over the years a lot about the term co-employment and what that means. And really the way to protect a client in those situations so they don't get sued is to have a contractual agreement that you'll indemnify and hold them harmless should some federal agency come after them and claim they're the employer. But that's sort of it in a nutshell. I don't know if that was too confusing or not.
So you start the company with your brother-in-law. So what was the big kind of any surprises in the first 6 to 12 months? Like, well, now I'm running a company. I didn't know this would be like this.
Yeah, if you can imagine, by that time I was renting a single law office space in Old Town Lenexa in an old kind of rock building that said law office on it. I'll never forget my brother-in-law who had worked for Tech Systems making really good money coming down the hallway, and I could see him that first day in his green suit hanging on to a little green phone and thinking to myself, I hadn't been married very long to my wife, a couple of years, I guess, and I was like, my in-laws are going to kill me if this doesn't work out. It's going to be my fault. And he sat down. I put a desk in my law office, and he sat down and plugged that green phone into the wall, and he just started cranking calls. But that was back before you had a lot of good intelligence you could get
Yeah, oh yeah.
online. He was just calling into companies, asking for someone in the IT department, and then he would say, "Hey, do you know anyone that's looking for a job, or do you guys use contractors?" And I can still remember one funny incident where I could hear he had been talking to someone, and they had asked him right when we started, "Well, how many contractors do you have on staff? How many people do you have on staff doing programming work?" And he's like, "Well, none, but we're working on it. We're trying to get more than none." And I thought, "Oh, this is so funny." And I
Oh,
think people fail to realize once you have some name recognition, it is so much easier to sell, even if there is competition, versus when you're just trying to break into a market. But I think the first thing for us was there were system integrators. They were called value added resellers that would resell compact computers and stuff like that. And our first big gig was they said they needed 11 people to start on a Monday, and this was on a Friday. And my brother-in-law went out there and found 11 people to do the job, had them all come in, sign their paperwork over the weekend, onboarding paperwork, and then drove them over to the client site on Monday morning. So we had 11 people right off the bat. My kind of oh shit moment was we ended up getting more traction. There were two oh shit moments. One was financially. We didn't take a salary, nothing for like 8 months, but it was always like when you're doing contracting work, unlike doing legal services and you bill it out by the hour or take a fee if you win a case, all of a sudden I had to come up with a few $100,000 to cover the payroll on these
right,
contractors.
right.
And because I'm not getting paid, until 30 days or more after the invoice is sent. So all of a sudden I'm out 60 days in payroll before I get the first 30 days paid. And so that gap really got me thinking about cash flow. And I am telling you, over 27, 28 years, we have almost never used our line of credit. We have always self funded ourselves with very few exceptions. When we had a big bump, let's say, and 20 people getting hired, and we kind of said, well, we could pump our own money back into it, but let's just use the line of credit for a few days or a few weeks. But that was one big issue. The other one was a friend of mine owned that building. He was a lawyer. There was only lawyers in there. I had an open area outside of my office and then another office next to mine. And so I rented those. And before I knew it, I had 9 people working in 200 square feet. And everyone was on the phone. There was a ton of buzz. I had 3 people in my office, 3 people in the other office, and 3 people kind of out in the middle of this area where the copier and the coffee machine were. And I was like, we got to get out of here. And I was just trying to keep costs down, but I realized what a disruption those 9 people were creating for my friend that owned the building that really cut me a break and let me stay there longer than I should have been allowed. So, yeah, I mean, for me, those were big moments. And then I think one of the harder things for me to ever get used to, and it really doesn't go away, is when you have to let someone go, recruiter, salesperson, or even when a client wants you to let someone go because they're not performing well. Ideally, I would have liked to have had something where we're all part of an organization where you make your career out of it. It just isn't the way it is in our business. It just isn't cut that way. And frankly, I don't know any business that's cut that way anymore. People bounce all the time.
You start in 1997, so probably get some of the benefits of those who remember Y2K. The world was going to end. Programs were not going to run because no one coded to go into a new century or whatever. Some of my code might be still laying around from my AT&T software application
I'm sure it
development
is.
days. little known fact, you had an author of the program, so people knew who authored it. I used to put Howard Stern for mine. Never revealed that before in public. So there you go.
There
But
you go.
anyhow, yeah. But you see that obviously in '08, you have a big recession. You run the business through COVID. So maybe take us through kind of your learnings and how the people, the programmers and the people have changed maybe, or the companies, and how'd you get through the dark periods, the highs
Yeah.
of the Y2K, the lows of the '08 recession and maybe COVID, but take us through that, Andrew.
Yeah, I think the first big sort of disruption we saw was the Y2K stuff. Sprint had used us, and we hired, I'm going to say, 50 people to work in 38 different states doing network operations sort of work to alleviate any Y2K concerns. When that went away and the clock turned to 2000 and there weren't any major glitches, we lost almost immediately about half of our contractors, and almost all of them were kind of what I would call telecom or network type people. That was a big blow. We lost about 50% of our revenue in 1 year, and then really pivoted into sort of IT recruiting with longer term contracts. That was no doubt a learning curve. We ended up doing better almost every year. We kept going up. And it's funny because Ingram's magazine always has this top three growing companies every year. And back in one of those early years, I think it must have been after 1999's revenue had come in, we were like number three in that magazine. I still remember being out at these stables, and the number one was John Sherman, the guy with energy that now is the primary owner, I think, of the Kansas City Royals.
Right.
Oh, if I could go back and say, John, can I have your brain and we can switch places and then you can be me and I can be you? But the next big disruption really was '07, '08, and '09 with the financial bust. The thing that was odd, let's say we had 100 W-2 consultants working at client sites. Let's say we get 400 hires on average a year. Our clients were terminating their full-time employees and keeping our contractors on site. That was totally unexpected. So instead of having an average duration of, say, 6-month contracts, we had an average duration of like 13 months. We did half as many placements, but had just the same, if not a little bit better revenue. When COVID came around, I suspected we would have the same sort of reaction. And it was completely different. They kept full time employees and they got rid of contractors. We pivoted at that time because it was such a blow to our IT business. It was a big blow. Tried to scramble about just a different offering that we might be able to implement. That was kind of the beginning of trying to do this other offering on professional services that I felt like we had to do. That was one thing that was a huge, huge pivot for us. The other thing was I've continued to notice over the last 5 or 10 years, a lot of our clients don't do contracting as much as they used to. It's almost as if they just want perm hires and they'll handle the issues. That try before you hire isn't as prevalent. And it could also be we had more federal contractors that were subbing to us back in the day. We had a DC office, we had a Dallas office, an Atlanta office, a Pittsburgh office, and we work with subcontractors like Northrop Grumman, CACI, EDS, who was a contractor of the USDA here in Kansas City. And that was really nice work because you'd put someone in there, and those were 5-year contracts. And that was very helpful. We just don't see that as much as we used to. So it definitely changes. Nothing stays the same, and you always got to keep your eye on the ball. And any other business owner, I'm sure, is going to say the same thing. You always have to be evaluating. You have to be both proactive and reactive, depending on what's going on with your market or your employee base.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Have you seen, obviously technology is different, right? There was no R or Python or whatever, programming languages there are versus, 27 years ago. But have you seen any like differences? I mean, there's been STEM initiatives. So is it, now more females in the IT application development space, or what are you seeing there?
I don't have any anecdotal evidence that will say, that it's more even. The tools themselves that we use in the recruiting world are far more extensive than they ever used to be. In the early days, you would use faxes and fax machines. You wouldn't have an applicant tracking system that you could put people's information in. You would have hot books, which were physical, physical binders where you would have a specialty like .NET programming or C Sharp or C++. And then you would have written out names and all that information about people that were good to go. And then they became almost friends because you would call them every week or whatever, find out where they're at, and they were a good referral source. I find that's totally lacking. I shouldn't say totally lacking. It's lacking in the same way it was 25 to 30 years ago. Because now, yes, but everyone's got the same tools. So your competition has the same tools you do. There's still an element of who's first to the punch to get a hold of that person. It's hard to determine if the level of relationship is there what it used to be. And I haven't totally responded to your question yet, but I do find it's ironic. I have 3 kids in their mid to late 20s, and the amount of relationship development that happens by text and email is still difficult for me to understand because to me, nothing replaces face to face meetings. Even Zoom, at least you can get an understanding of what someone's nonverbal cues are and things of that nature. But going back to your question, do I think there's more women in it? Yes, of course I do. I actually think there are more people that are US citizens in it. Years ago, we were dealing a lot with people that had H-1B visas and were being sponsored by companies that just happened to have a presence in the United States. And we even did some of that. But it's really spread out quite a bit now among, I would say, a bunch of different countries. And so, yes, there used to be a lot of outsourcing to other countries. Now, what you're seeing is a lot of close to shore sourcing if they want to get a better rate, like down to South America. That part has changed. The basic identities of, the people that are doing the programming and the work, I suppose it's a little bit different, just based on my observations and gut feel after doing it for 27 years. It seems like a lot more of the contractors that we send to client sites have a much diverse variety of skills, both from a technical standpoint, but also soft skills, being able to relate to clients. They totally understand the importance of being able to have conversations. And I think the clients have gotten a lot better over the last 25 years of being able to interact with people of different backgrounds. I think it was a lot harder 25 years ago.
The old days of having programmers sit in a dark closet with a ton of Mountain Dew are done, they're saying.
Well, I don't know if they're done. I think maybe they're done remotely, but now they the description of what's being done gets them put in front of a project manager, who obviously can get behind the scenes. They're much more able, I think, to evaluate the work that's being done, the quality that's being done, and also expecting a lot more from those programmers that sit back in a closet with their Mountain Dew from a communication standpoint. It's like, okay, I see this. I see what you've done.
Sure.
Now talk to me.
Not necessarily starting up a professional staffing and IT recruiting firm, but just any advice you would give some person that's thinking about starting a business and whatever type of business. What kind of advice, based on your experience the last 27, 28 years, would you give them?
I've heard necessity is the mother of all innovation. And I think back to my youth, and I really felt like some of my motivation was just necessity. It was like, I don't have these blocks over here. I have to figure something out. So where's the low hanging fruit? And I think today a lot of people look for low barrier to entry. One of the things that I talk to, either with my kids or their friends or other people that are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, or whatever, is really trying to figure out, how do I evaluate this idea that I have without spending too much time or money on it to see if it has any teeth? And I've made mistakes before. I tried to start a lawn and landscape company 12 years ago, and I learned a boatload just from trial and error, but I spent a lot of money on it. I would tell people to try to find things that have recurring revenue and you can see a pipeline down the road 6 months or 12 months. And I think of groups like insurance companies, right? I mean, if you're the incumbent broker, all you have to do is keep the client happy. Anybody that has long-term contracts where you can be the incumbent with that particular organization, because a lot of people are going into service-based businesses now. It's one thing for me to say, oh, if you're going into a product-based business, the old adage was, try to create a minimally viable product, an MVP, get it to MVP level. And I had tried that too. We worked on some logistics software 10 years ago that was really fabulous, and it worked well and it needed some tweaks. But there were other people doing it. And the guy that was trying to sell it for us was not really able to get in front of enough people. But again, by that time, we had spent a lot of money developing it. It was great, it worked great, but you need to know someone's going to be out there and paying for it. And so my idea is always like, hey, look at the idea. I believe it or not, in the last 6 months, I've been a big fan of going to some of these AI sites and just typing in questions like, okay, explain to me, what are some of the obstacles that I'm going to have if I think about, trying to get into this type of industry? You can even say in Kansas or in Missouri. Where can I go get federal contracts? Can I get a federal contract at all, or state and local contracts? Any industry, you're going to get information spit out to you that to me is a lot more thorough than just Google. Google has an AI component to it. I like that. But I have found I get information faster and more complete and thorough from using some of these AI tools. And I would always reach out. I tell my kids, reach out to someone that's in the industry. I mean, that's what we used to do in the old days. Talk to somebody, see if you can build up a referral source. You need a network. And I think I'm just going to tell you, networking is critical. You got to be willing to put yourself out there in a variety of roles and get involved. And people that don't do that, I think, have a really tough time, because being an entrepreneur, you've got to wear a lot of different hats. You kind of got to know accounting, you got to know sales, you got to know hiring, firing, um, and you've got to be able to cover all those bases. And I have run into far too many people in this era, and I'm in groups like Vistage and a couple others with other CEOs, and we all have sort of agreed that though there's nothing wrong with this generation, we had our issues when we were a younger generation that the older generation didn't like. But to us, there's still no substitute for being involved in the community. Uh, whether it's your church or a board, or just connecting with people at professional events, or when I was an attorney, getting on a committee, going to bar association events. Get your face out there, get your personality out there, and represent yourself. And the key difference that I remember, and I tell people this when I talk to them about it, when I left the big firm and started my own law firm, I had so much more confidence because I was talking about me. You're coming to me. When I wasn't always sure, when I, was sort of representing the law firm to some degree, is I'm just trying to take care of their clients. I'm trying not to piss off the partners. I'm trying to do everything right. But when it's you, I found it a lot easier to market myself and force myself to go attend. And the other thing too is nothing comes naturally. I mean, I talk too much. My wife tells me that all the time, as do my I want to give a shout out to Toastmasters. It's a free international public speaking organization. And I thought, going through law school and trying my first case when I was in law school, and always being sort of a talker, that I'm not going to have any issues. But I thought, you know what? A friend invited me to one of them. And we met at 7 o'clock in the morning at the Holiday Inn on Shawnee Mission Parkway on Mondays. And they have a little program there with a non-judgmental group of people that are in there with you, and you go through kind of a 10-speech notebook. I got done, with that group, and I can remember going to hearings at the courthouse and listening to, oral argument on briefs and whatnot, or even opening and closing statements. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, so many of those people that I was in that class with would have done 10 times better than most of those attorneys I was looking at. Not that they weren't good, not that they weren't competent, but the question is, how effective are you? How persuasive are you? And that was a free program, or maybe I had to pay $15 or something. So it takes effort, though, to go out there and try to improve your own skills. It takes effort, if you're curious about something, to go vet the situation. I find I talk to so many people and I fill out a little, sheet that says, okay, here's the action sheet, just like we do in Vistage. Then I say, okay, come back to me in a month, schedule me in a month, and we're going to go over this and see how far you've gotten. And for a time, I volunteered with the SCORE organization, which is to help people that might want to start a deal. And I had the same issue, probably 10 people in a room. I'm like, well, I'll tell you what, I'm meeting with you. Now go back and just write down a few things. Doesn't have to be anything. It can be on a napkin. 90 times out of 100, they just never came back after that first conversation. Anyone can say anything. You can read a million business books and startup books in the world. But unless you put in the effort and put in the work, which is a lot, you're just wasting your time.
Right.
It's not a theoretical issue. It's a practical live in your life issue.
Two questions I ask everyone that's been on the podcast is because I like to help two groups of people. And I think you've given some of that advice, but one's that recent college graduate, they're 22, 23, whatever age. They're trying to figure it out. They're going to try to get their first job, begin their professional career journey. What advice do you have for them as they start that journey?
I think when I think about the people I've talked to, sometimes it depends on the size of the organization. If it's a big organization, like for me, it was a law firm back in the day, my advice is get to know as many people as you can at that company, find out what kind of departments they have. And instead of saying, I hate my job and I want to get out of here as fast as I can, save as much money as you can, be frugal as you can, but try to understand and have lunch with or breakfast with as many different people in different departments, just if for no other reason, you're just networking in addition to learning. I think if you're in a smaller company, you have much greater and easier access to the leadership in that company. And I think it would be a lot easier for you to learn kind of the inner workings of how a business works. So, whether you're in a big company, a small company, to me, it's all about getting together with the people that you work with first to figure out, hey, what makes them tick? How did you get started? Kind of like what you're doing with this podcast. It's like trying to go figure out what's worked and what doesn't work. And a lot of people just aren't willing to do that. They just want to get their money and leave and don't have an interest in that because they're thinking so hard about either what they don't like or what other job they might be interested in. And the grass is always greener. But I tell my kids, I'm like, save as much money as you can because what everyone in society is doing is trying to figure out a way to get to financial independence and do it hopefully with something that they like. And I'm not one of these people that believes, oh, you have to love what you do. The Taiwan semiconductor founder was in Wall Street Journal recently talking about this issue. And he's like, I worked and worked and worked. I started this company when I was 52. I think he's like 90 something now. And he said, I just don't get this next generation that says, love what you do and you'll never work a day in your life. He's like, yeah, you don't want to be oppressed, but work is work. And it doesn't mean you can't have fun doing it. I've written a lot of articles that are on my LinkedIn page about the value of work and the dignity of work and how it's not something to be shrugged upon and looked down upon. It actually provides value, self esteem, and dignity, even if it's not something you love doing. And I don't know anybody my age who says, oh, I've loved what I've done my entire career, except for my dad, who has been a social worker for
Right.
60 plus years.
Any quick advice on if you're in that last semester, senior year, and you're going to graduate, any advice to them to actually land the job?
It's almost a sales job like we do. Is there anything of added value that would distinguish and differentiate you from whoever your, competing candidates might be? And instead of thinking about yourself, it's really like trying to understand that company if you really want the job and making some sort of offer to them that, hey, if you want me to do something for you, whether it's do some research or whether it's attend a social event with you so you can see how I interact if it's a sales type position, or just see how I generally get along in different settings, I am more than welcome to go. But I'm totally interested in seeing if there's anything I can do that would provide value right now in helping you decide whether you think I'm a good candidate or not. And I think just offering that and having the confidence and the comfortability of just offering that is going to put you in a category that's different because you're not hired yet. You don't really know what you're going to be required to do. But if you leave it open ended, like I'm willing to help anything that might help you, and if and try to get them and draw that out of them. There is a book that I've been reading recently called The Experience Economy, and it kind of gets to that issue. It's more for companies saying, okay, you've got all this competition, you all do the same thing. How can you create something that's not a commodity, but an experience for whoever's getting the information so they remember you as an experience different than what the others were doing?
Right.
And I'm also reading a book that I think is very interesting called Never Split the Difference by, an FBI former hostage negotiator or whatever. It's not so much a strategy book as it's sort of a tactic book, and it's meant to not be manipulative about how you get what you want, but how everybody can come to an understanding, and that you don't just take no, or you don't take someone's initial answer to one of your questions as that's the final solution. Okay, I need to leave. But it's not being obnoxious, right? Getting on the phone like telemarketers and never accepting no as an answer.
Right,
That's not
right, right.
it either.
The one other group I love helping, Andrew, with the wisdom of great leaders like yourself, is once that person decides to take a career path where they're actually going to lead a team of people on an org chart and be responsible for them, what advice do you have as they begin their leadership journey?
This is probably the most important advice I can give. It has been going on since my law school days on up till to now. My law career, and even, I'm not doing it so much now, but used to take depositions of team members, leaders, and big corporations. I would always say at the end of the day, when I did seminars for companies, when they wanted a plaintiff's attorney to come in, is like, treat people the way you want to be treated. Hands down, the most important thing, and have a service like this for prospective and clients, is make sure that while your eye is on the ball of what your company does and how it makes money and how it sells, never forget that the culture of what makes that engine run are the employees internally. And what I have found on a once a month basis or once every 6 week basis, if the leader of the team, separate and apart from just the daily machinations of what's going on in the ebb and flow of the business, can get that person and go to that person or go out to lunch and talk to them and say, hey, just tell me what's going on. What do you think? I'm totally confidential. We do that as a third party because I have seen the value, even with my own company, of building relationships with those employees where they think you actually care about what's going on in their lives. It may sound touchy feely, but if you have an interest in them, they're far less likely to go out there and start looking for other jobs. It just takes time, it takes emotional effort, but your turnover will be lower, your commitment will be greater. People will talk better about you behind your back with the other people that are on your team. And I'll tell you, once you establish that working relationship with them where you are authentic and they feel safe being authentic, and this takes several months to do, it doesn't happen the first time. There is no substitute where people, I think, will stay with great team members, leaders. I hear it all the time because they love who they work for, or they could go somewhere else and make more money, but they don't know if they could get that same kind of dialogue and relationship at the next place.
Most people are not like the past generation of workers, more physical labor, assembly line, things like that. And Seth Godin calls it the emotional labor of leadership. It's taking that time to get to know somebody, what triggers them, what's their life like, because to understand that and to care about them as a person is just so important. Andrew, I really enjoyed our conversation. I love what you've done. I could talk to you all day. So thank you for coming on the Corporate Couch today.
Hey, appreciate it. Enjoyed meeting you for coffee and enjoyed the podcast, and continued success. And I'll look forward to catching up with you down the road.
So many things I loved about my conversation with Andrew. Just a really fascinating person, and just kind of the salt of the earth. And I know we don't use the video much, but he's just when we met over coffee a couple months ago, you could tell he probably played football, at least in high school. I think his son plays collegiate football. A nice guy, hard worker. Just the impact, growing up. He's turned 14. His older brother, who was, I believe, a sophomore at Kansas State University, dies of cancer. Parents divorced the same year, and the impact that had on him. And that, high school, your teen, 14 to 18 is at least for me, it was, it's a lot of challenge, I think, socially, self-esteem wise, fitting in, and then how he pivots, wasn't a good student, didn't have a great GPA, got a job at Sherwin-Williams. I didn't realize Sherwin-Williams was kind of a hotbed for college graduates because of their training program. I found that out in Andrew's conversation and a subsequent one I had this week also. And then how he just basically studies his ass off, does mock LSATs every weekend for 8 months,
That is dedication.
And
And,
hard worker. Like you can see it, like just a hard worker. And then he creates this company with his brother-in-law. And you talk about things coming together to build a company. His brother-in-law was in IT recruiting sales for Tech Systems, a well-known company. I forget the founder's name, but he owns the Baltimore Ravens today. And he's a lawyer in employment law and HR law, and most of his clients were IT people. And this, that convergence of his brother-in-law and him come together to build an IT staffing and recruiting firm that is almost 28 years in business. It's just phenomenal. And the leadership, founding company lessons of, oh shit, I got to make payroll. That type of thing. And 9 people in the original 200 square foot office with like 8 of those people on the phone constantly.
I've worked in offices like that before.
Yeah.
And it seems like there were a couple of other businesses that he started that he casually mentioned, and you kind of wonder, well, what else was there that happened in all of that too?
Yeah, lessons of, not fearing failure, trying other things. I mean, they try to productize some logistics software, but, learned a lot. It was great software, he said, but it didn't work. It was functional. They couldn't get clients for it.
It wasn't marketable, and so they said, well, okay, that was a lesson learned. Let's go on to the next thing.
Yeah, and then a lawn and landscaping business. I mean, it's just very interesting. He doesn't fear failure, and he's just, I loved our conversation.
Yeah, it was great. One of the things that I picked up on and was fascinated by was this discussion that you and he had about non-compete clauses in employment agreements, that if you leave a company, the original company can actually manage how you find your next job. I'll have to admit I'm kind of torn on that, because on the one hand, I can understand the side of the corporation, the argument that they have, that if they are in some very highly competitive industry and there are only just a few incumbents in that industry, that you can't have an employee that now knows all of your corporate secrets go to your competition and reveal all of those secrets and give them an advantage. I can kind of see that, but at the same time, the non-compete agreements can't be onerous. They can't say, no, you can never work for that company ever, or for the next 15 years, or anywhere in the world, or anywhere in the country, or something like that. There has to be some bounds around that. And that's a very delicate balancing act that I'm just fascinated by. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. It'll be interesting to see how that, levels out with the Department of Labor and the federal government eventually.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I've always, I like you, I totally see both sides of it. It's just when somebody, riffs you, a reduction in force, eliminates your position, and you prevent them, that's where I get. And I'm not saying, stealing company secrets or giving company secrets to a competitor, but there's some balance. But we can have a whole episode about non-compete probably.
Interesting.
Joe, based on Andrew's episode, what leadership wisdom would you love to give the audience today?
We're going to go to that great philosopher, Groucho Marx, that you may have heard of. And one of the times he said, he was talking to somebody else, he said, I never forget a face, but in your case, I'll make an exception.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.